Most of us were alive. This isn't 150 years ago. Well, in 1963, in what was his last public bill signing, President Kennedy signed a $3 billion authorizing act that would have created this wonderful national community mental health system. And the idea was to take people from these houses of horror and slowly reintegrate them back into the community through the National Health Act. A lot of people don't know this, but President Kennedy's sister, Rose, had serious mental health issues. She had been lobotomized, it was butchered, and she suffered for the rest of her life. And they were very, very sensitive to the issue. Well, this is where Alabama comes into play. Well, tragically, due to the president's assassination and the escalation of the Vietnam War, not one penny of the $3 billion that had been authorized by Congress got appropriated by Congress. Well, a lawsuit gets filed right down the street in Tuscaloosa at Bryce Hospital. Interestingly enough, not by the advocates, but by the doctors. Because why? Alabama was going to cut the cigarette tax, which was funding the hospital. And the doctors got nervous they were going to lose their jobs. And there was this little kid named Ricky Wyatt, who was a juvenile, who didn't have mental illness, but he was a delinquent, and they stuck him in the hospital. So the case ended up in front of one of the best, most famous judges, not only Alabama produced, but the United States produced, Judge Johnson. The case came in front of Judge Johnson, and the first thing he did, he looked at the docs and said, "Hey, I'm really sorry, but you're SOL. If you don't know what that means, you can come see me after as well." Because I can't tell Alabama who to hire and fire. However, he says, and he reaches in and he grabs jurisdiction, because clearly Judge Johnson, because there was so much publicity going on about the state of these hospitals, grabs jurisdiction and he says, and you have to read the opinion because the adjectives in this opinion are nothing like you will ever see. He goes on and calls this hospital all kinds of fancy names, and none of them are good. And he describes the condition of this population, and he says this has to change. Because at the time, under the Constitution of the United States, we already had decided that if you were in jail, you had certain constitutional protections for a certain level of health care. But no such conditions existed if you were in a civil hospital. And so what Judge Johnson basically does is he extends those protections to a civil state hospital. And he actually lists 80 specific changes that he tells Alabama that they have to change in this hospital. He even goes so far to tell them how hot the water needed to be in the dishwashers because they weren't cleaning utensils and people were getting physically sick. Now, in order to get them to do it, Judge Johnson threatens Alabama. And he says, "Look, if you don't make all these changes, I'm shutting down the hospital." And he figures, and I'm projecting just by reading his opinion so many times, that Judge Johnson figures that Alabama doesn't want all these people with mental illnesses out on the street, so they're going to make the changes. And to Alabama's credit, at one point, you had some of the most innovative, finest changes in the United States because of this opinion. Well, they kind of ran out of money. Judge Johnson didn't like what he was seeing, and he started shutting some stuff down. The case got appealed, makes its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and for the most part, it is upheld. And now there is an earthquake. Because if you have a state hospital, and everybody does, you have two choices. You could spend the billions of dollars it's going to take to upgrade the facility, or you could shut down the facility and provide community-based treatment. There's only one problem. President Kennedy's Community Act never got funded, because we know what the states did. They shut down the hospitals as quick as they could to save the money. Well, we know what happened from there. And the impact has been staggering. In 1955, there were 560,000 people in state hospitals. If nothing had changed, and I'm not advocating that, I just want to make a point and put this in context. If nothing had changed, there would be about 1.5 million people today in state hospitals. Right now, there are less than 30,000 people in state hospitals around the United States. Last year, ironically, while I said there was 2 million arrested people with mental illnesses, it involved 1.5 million people. Almost the exact number of people that were arrested last year with serious mental illnesses would have been in state hospitals today had nothing had changed. And so there's two really, really horrible ironies. Number one is we never deinstitutionalized. What we did is we transferred responsibility from these really horrible state hospitals to these really horrible jails. But we've made it worse, because why? Now, not only do you have to deal with the stigma of having a mental illness, now you are the stigma, a criminal with mental illness, making it harder to get employment, making it harder to get housing, making it more likely you're going to continue to recycle through the criminal justice system your entire life. And the sadder and maybe cruel irony here is that almost 200 years have passed in this country since Dorothea Dix did her thing, and jails have once again become the primary place for people with mental illnesses. This is the one area in civil rights we have failed miserably, and in some ways we have gone backwards, and we have failed people with mental illnesses miserably. The consequences are clear. We've seen homelessness increase. We've seen police injuries increase. We've seen police shootings of people with mental illnesses increase. We've wasted critical tax dollars, and in many ways we have made mental illness a crime in this country. In my own state, our police initiate more involuntary mental health examinations than the total number of arrests they make for robbery, burglary, and grand theft auto combined. It's insane. And if this wasn't disturbing enough, and this doesn't pull at your heartstrings, which I understand it doesn't for all, let's talk about the financial implications, because that always gets everyone's attention. So when we started our project about 16, 17 years ago, we knew that we needed to focus on the people that were accessing the resources the most, the highest utilizers of both criminal justice and mental health services. And we have a wonderful institution at the University of South Florida in Tampa, which isn't in South Florida, but that's Florida for you. And they have something called the Florida Mental Health Institute, and they are one of the only institutions in the United States that have these blended data sets of all the involuntary hospitalization records, all the criminal justice records, all the Medicaid and Medicare records, and they can tell a community who the highest utilizers of both criminal justice and mental health services are, because we want it to be efficient, and we knew we needed to do this right. So I sent them the names of thousands of people that had been arrested over a 5-year period in Miami, that had been segregated on the mental health floors, that we knew had some sign of mental illness. I waited, and finally a letter appears, and I'm all excited, and I open it up, and to my astonishment, there is one piece of paper in the envelope. And on this piece of paper are the names of 97 people, primarily men, primarily diagnosed with a schizophrenia-type disorder, primarily homeless, and primarily co-occurring, meaning they had a substance addiction along with their mental illness, who over a 5-year period, these 97 people were arrested 2,200 times. They spent 27,000 days in that horrible jail on the video, 13,000 days at an emergency room, crisis unit, or psychiatric facility, and cost the taxpayers in my community $13.7 million, and we got absolutely nothing for it. We often joke, but it's serious. We would have been better off sending them to Harvard, because then at least they might have had a shot at an education. And if this wasn't bad enough, let's talk real quickly about competency restoration, which your legislators and your commissioner should be very, very concerned about. My state of Florida spends 22% of its entire adult mental health budget, that's $135 million a year, to restore competency for 3,000 people. 22% of its entire budget. We have between 150 and 160,000 people in Florida who at the time of their arrest need acute mental health care treatment, but we're spending 22% on 3,000 people. Now, maybe it would be worth it if that 3,000 people had committed heinous acts and they needed to be in prison and off the streets. But for 70% of those 3,000 people, 3 things happen to them. They either have the charges dropped, they get credit for the time they've been at the facility, or they get probation. And under all 3 scenarios, they walk out the front steps of the courthouse without any access to treatment. It's the definition of insanity, where you keep doing the same thing again and again and you expect a different outcome. And it is the only part of the mental health budget in the state of Florida that is growing because it is an entitlement and the state has no choice. And so where do you think the states take the money to fund that entitlement? They take it from the community mental health system, making access to services more difficult, pushing more people into the criminal justice, and watching this balloon. And if this wasn't bad enough, let's talk about my prison. So in Florida, the prison general population, which was going up like this, is leveled out somewhat. So over the last 12 years, it's increased by about 50%. Well, the mental health population in those same years has actually increased by 178%. Our prison population for people with mental illnesses is growing so fast right now that if we don't do something immediately to curb the growth, Florida will have to build 10 new prisons over the next 10 years just for its mental health population. Well, folks, the cost to build and operate 10 prisons in Florida over 10 years for people with mental illnesses is over $2.2 billion. And because they're not committing serious offenses, the average stay is only 2.5 to 4 years. And they're going to leave that prison and go back to the same inadequate community mental health system that got them there to begin with. There clearly is something wrong with a society that's willing to spend more money to incarcerate people that are ill than to treat them. So how do we fix it? I know that's all gloom and doom you've heard, but I have great news. This is a fixable problem. 16 years ago, we had a summit in Miami, and I will tell you it is good to be judged because you can make people come to a meeting that don't want to come. And I invited all the traditional and non-traditional stakeholders that needed to get together to create a systematic structural change in my community to stop doing what we were doing. And it was a fascinating 2 days. In the first half day, we literally wrote out on paper all around the room how our criminal justice system intersected with our community mental health system. And what we found is it did not. We were embarrassingly dysfunctional. We were supposedly the smart, healthy people. And we looked around the room and we wondered who was more sick. And it was typical of the story of the psychiatrist. Man was sick, he'd get arrested, we'd order thousands of dollars of evaluations and kick him back to the street without any services. And we decided we needed to do 2 immediate changes. We needed a pre-arrest diversion program, and we needed a post-arrest diversion program. We looked around the country, and it was very clear to us the best program in the United States was Sam Cochran's program at Memphis.